Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Schwartz, CEO of the California Housing Partnership. And the topic today is the impact of the pandemic and the federal elections on federal housing policy. And with me to help us explore these topics are Sarah Brendage, Senior Director for Public Policy at Enterprise Community Partners. Another Sarah Saadian, who's now Vice President of Public Policy for the National Income Housing Coalition, and Peter Lawrence, who is Director of Public Policy for Novogradac and Company. So welcome all of you. It's great to be together again. We typically meet to have this discussion at least once a year, and normally I'm thanking you for flying all the way to California. This time, I think, thankfully for all of us, you're not making that trip, but each of you is dealing with your own challenges. So I really appreciate the efforts you've made to make this recording possible that we're doing here today. Our first topic is we're right now in the thick of a really disappointing debate on Congress and the White House about how the federal government should be reacting to the pandemic with respect to housing policy in particular, which is our context. I'd like to hear from each of you more about your perspectives on what are the main differences between the House, the Senate, and the White House proposals, and how do we get stuck here, and how are we in a situation where Congress has left Washington and there's no deal? So, Sarah Saadian, I'd like to start with you because you've had a lot of involvement, as you all have, in the House proposal in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So the House bill is part of a $3 trillion package, so a very robust package. There's about $200 billion in that bill that passed out of the House, the HEROES Act, for housing. That included about $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, $75 billion in homeowner assistance, and lots of other resources, including $13 billion or so for households currently living in HUD and USDA housing to make sure that they can stay stably housed, in addition to about $11.5 billion in resources to prevent outbreaks among people who are experiencing homelessness. So it's a really robust, comprehensive package. The Senate, on the other hand, put together a really paltry housing proposal. It's only part of a $1 trillion package, and of that, a little bit more than $3 billion is included in housing, really just limited to those households that are currently living in HUD Section 8 or public housing, in case their incomes go down and to help adjust for that need for more rental income. But there's a huge difference here, and it's not just on the housing space, it's overall. The House and Senate are very far apart, and that's part of the reason why we haven't been able to see a deal get reached just yet, because there's so much daylight between the two, and while there's some interest to get a deal done, especially among Republicans who might be up for a tough re-election in the fall, or those more moderate members of their parties, the Republican Party is very divided, and there's a big segment of Senate Republicans, maybe up to 20 Senate Republicans, who won't vote for any package. And so all of that is leading to a lot of confusion and disorganization, and it makes it harder to deal. On the White House side, there is some openness to housing and homelessness resources, although no formal offer has been made about specific numbers of how much they've offered on that. And I think there's also division within the White House. We're seeing that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin is really hopeful for a bill, is pushing forward on that, but there might be other pieces to the administration that's maybe a little bit more reluctant to sign on to a bill and doesn't want to see something that's too big in scope. So there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of dysfunction, which is why we haven't seen a bill so far. And I think part of it also is just a strategic miscalculation on the part of Senate Republicans. They waited for months to start negotiations, thinking that when unemployment expired or the eviction moratorium expired, when PPP loans would expire, that would give them more leverage in a deal. And remains to be seen whether or not that was a strategic smart move, or if it's something that is just adding more pressure to them and breaking apart the discord within them.
That's a great summary. So I'm going to call you Sarah S., if I may, for this conversation. Sarah B., please give me any additional take from your enterprise community partners perspective.
Yeah, I have to agree with Sarah. I mean, I think ultimately our collective housing priorities are getting stuck in much bigger politics. And like Sarah said, this really comes down to disagreements about how much to spend on the next COVID package. And also, I think where there seems to be a lot of disagreement is should the next package offer short-term or longer-term solutions in terms of how much they extend unemployment insurance to PPP loans to the eviction moratorium. And I do think it was interesting, you know, President Trump did August 8th sign 4 executive orders. One he, presented as if it was an extension of the eviction moratorium, although it did not actually authorize an extension of the eviction moratorium. It really just called for the Treasury and HUD to try to find funding to support renters or homeowners. He doesn't actually have the authority to, I don't believe, to extend the CARES Act eviction moratorium. But I mean, I thought what was interesting about that for all of us is that it shows that, the White House is also feeling pressure to address the eviction swell that we're all expecting to see, given the CARES Act eviction moratorium is expired. So, and I think also the break between, initially negotiations were being led by Mitch McConnell, and now it's really between Mnuchin, Meadows representing the White House with Pelosi and Schumer. So weirdly, it feels like Senate Republicans have almost even been cut out of the mix. So that has definitely complicated things.
Thanks, Sarah. Sarah B. Peter, so this morning I saw our friends at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities summarize the situation in an interesting way. They said if you add up the proposals from the White House and from the Senate Republicans, you actually get to a number of about $2 trillion. So this idea that we're so far apart between the $3 trillion proposed by the House and the $1 trillion limit proposed by the White House, should there be a middle ground here? How is it that there's no way to make a deal? What's going on from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, I think one thing to make sure you keep in mind is there is a significant set of the Senate Republican Conference that doesn't want any deal whatsoever. They don't want to have one additional cent. So I think we need to keep that in mind. That Senator.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Given that there are certainly vulnerable members of the Senate, there are about 6 senators who are in very, very tight races, and Senator McCaskill is trying to get those. Henry, can you pause for a second?
It's okay. We all know everyone's Zooming from home.
Don't cut it out.
Okay, sorry about that. I really apologize.
Okay, take your time.
So I think that we need to keep in mind that eventually a deal needs 60 votes in the Senate, and getting that, finding a path towards uniting the set of senators who are dead opposed against any deal versus the ones who desperately need it, given how they're tight races, is going to be a challenge. I do think that I've seen a big evolution when the Senate began negotiating. The initial stance was no rental assistance at all, and no changes on or any extensions of an eviction moratorium. I think you're beginning to see more and more a case where the Senate Republicans are realizing that those things are absolutely needed, and that I think given some time, given some more pressure when those executive actions that Sarah mentioned, have proven not sufficient to deal with the situation, the Senate Republicans will be forced to the table to cut some sort of deal.
So let's talk about timing for a minute here. So right now, Congress is on recess. Unless something changes, they might not be back to the middle of September. What's the window? Is the window to make a stimulus deal over, or is there still a window? I'd like to hear from each of you just quickly. What's the window, and what's your prediction on whether there's a deal or not, and anything helpful for housing? Starting with you, Sarah S.
Yeah, I mean, they have to reach a deal. I think there's still room for a deal to be made, despite all the challenges all of us have talked about. Right now, they're on recess. They could come back before recess is scheduled to be over if a deal is struck. But this week is the DNC National Convention. There's the Republican Convention. And then we're already at the end of the month. And so we might not see a deal until they return after Labor Day. I will say that once we start getting into September, there's a lot of bad possibilities here. One is that a coronavirus relief package is tied to a spending bill or a continuing resolution, which would keep the government funded for a couple months through the election. That's not ideal. It could risk a government shutdown again right before the election. We don't want to see that. There's also a possibility that as we get closer to the election, it'll be harder and harder for a deal to be made just because of the politics of it. But I do think for now, I'm hoping that we see something in early to mid-September.
And Sarah Brundage, as you answer the question, I'm also curious if there's a chance the whole debate around whether the United States Postal Service needs some attention by Congress to facilitate the elections happening fairly. Could that be a help in getting folks back into DC and maybe making some progress on stimulus, or just totally unrelated and no help?
I don't know that those things will be connected in terms of them passing a bigger package. Speaker Pelosi is calling a special hearing, I believe, on the 24th, so about the Postal Service, and I expect we'll see legislation coming from Democrats to try to block the president from, taking stabs at the ability for us to do mail-in ballots. But I agree with Sarah that in terms of spending packages and COVID packages, that will be on a separate timeline. I also think it really is September or bust, because October is just too close to the election. People will be very distracted. So I think it's in everyone's interest across party lines to get something done in September. The question is, like Sarah said, will it be combined with a short-term CR, which is needed to keep the government open? I've even heard maybe it'll be tied to funding for the National Highway Trust Fund. I think it's anyone's best guess right now, but it's really in everyone's interest to get it done early in September.
Thank you. Peter, your thoughts about timing?
I agree. I do think, we know that the House has made clear they want to keep COVID-19 separate from the spending package, but for purposes of the Senate, where, floor time in the Senate is so precious, and that for those purposes, I can imagine having just one single vote to be able to address, the continuing resolution for the federal government, extending the highway and surface transportation law, and dealing with the COVID-19 one fell swoop. I think that is the next likely timeline. October will be too soon before the election. And the other thing to just keep in mind, with the nature of lame duck sessions also, that's a variable there too. Sometimes Congress, especially if there's a change in power, if Vice President Biden wins in November and the Senate flips to being Democratic, there's a good chance that Democrats will want to wait till January before taking action. And I think that is one component of the decision on timing in the fall.
That's
I
really
do want to say, I would just love to add on to Peter's point, which is we could definitely see those things play out. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that that's really too late for Congress to prevent a huge wave of evictions. We need action much sooner than that. And we and other researchers have estimated that somewhere between 30 and 40 million renters could be at risk of eviction by the end of the year. And I think all of us are rightfully working and putting pressure on Congress to make sure that something happens sooner rather than on that later time horizon that Congress might be envisioning.
That's a really good reminder, Sarah Saadian, and we've actually published research. Not only would it be the low-income renters who are being decimated without further congressional action, but even the nonprofit affordable housing providers are at serious risk here. We expect somewhere around a 25% loss in rent collections that's going to begin to happen if Congress doesn't act. That will cost, put nonprofit housing properties in California, the roughly 300,000 affordable homes, about $350 million in the red if it continues through into next year. So the stakes are really high. It could not only affect the tenants, it could collapse part of our existing infrastructure, which is already inadequate. So we're now getting into the appropriations discussion. I want to push us forward there. So a couple of you have already mentioned this point that September 30 is a year end. It's already almost upon us. The House has passed an initial proposal for at least for U.S. Department of Housing, and I'll actually put it up on screen in a minute. But I'd like to hear from each of you about your thoughts about, what's going to happen in the Senate, and are we looking at a continuing resolution seems likely by September 30. But any other thoughts you might have about, how the election might go and how that might affect the outcome on the appropriations as I put that up on the screen. Who wants to start that one? Sarah
I can give it a go, just to give a little background about the House bill first. So the House passed all 12 of their appropriations bills. The THUD bill is really strong in a year that we thought was going to be really difficult. So when Congress reached a bipartisan budget agreement, there was only about $5 billion more this year for Congress to allocate than from last year. And we know that just keeping up with inflationary costs for rental assistance, HUD would need about $1.5 billion more. In the House bill, HUD programs got that money and then some. They went really broad and big on their investments in housing. And just to point out a couple of things that are really good, it's about $12 billion more than the president's budget, which would have slashed HUD programs. And it included a really important legislative language, policy change language, that if we were to have a CR would be very difficult, if not impossible to get. So that's sort of the threat that if there is a CR, and I think there will be a CR at least through the election, and as Peter was saying, depending on the outcome of the election, Democrats might find it in their best interest to push off budget decisions until the following year. We've seen that happen in the past. All of that puts a lot of pressure on HUD programs and their ability to serve people. It's not really the best outcome for housing programs, but it could mean that in the end you get more funding than if a deal had been reached in December, right? So there's a trade-off there. Just to point to a couple of the important provisions that were in the housing bill, HUD bill, it pushes back on the administration's efforts, anti-transgender rule change to the equal access rule, which would have allowed for shelter providers to discriminate against transgender people seeking shelter. It pushes back on the administration's attempts to undermine Housing First, which is a evidence-based approach to addressing homelessness. It pushes back on HUD's continual request for rent increases, time limits, work requirements in housing programs, and many other pieces too that we won't get into. So it was a really strong bill. The risk here is that we might not be able to see a full appropriations bill at least through December and maybe even longer than that.
Thanks. Sarah Brundage.
I wouldn't add anything to that besides that this is honestly kind of unusual. I believe I heard that, for the Senate to not have marked up any of its bills and for it to, be unlikely to look at the next year's appropriations till after an election, that this hasn't happened since 1985. So we're kind of in uncharted waters. But I think the election could dramatically determine FY21 appropriations if the Senate, if the Senate flips in terms of how far we think the House version will go in negotiations or not. So, but I mean, I will just echo what Sarah said. It was a great package from the House, and I think it's a testimony to all the advocacy work. So, people watching this panel who've done outreach, it just shows that despite HUD having many housing programs, and we often get nervous about members of Congress really understanding the distinction between them and why we need all of them, and that all that advocacy work is really paying off.
Very helpful, thanks. Peter, I think you mentioned before the potential confluence that the Senate may only want to vote once. So as part of the House bill, what jumped out to me, and I think Sarah's have touched on it also, is that there were essentially stimulus items added on to the normal appropriations. I'm just going to put those up on the screen, but please speculate a little bit on how this might play out in the Senate as we approach the September 30 deadline, if you would, please.
Sure. I think one thing to keep in mind is that, about the same time that the House acted on the HUD appropriations bill, they also did act on a broad scale House infrastructure financing legislation. And I think that was the sort of the Appropriations Committee's priorities of what they saw as an infrastructure investment that dealt with housing. And so, while I think that as the Senate is currently constructed, they aren't going anywhere. But, as we've been sort of hinting and talking about throughout this session, if the Senate does flip to being controlled by Democrats, suddenly those one-time investments maybe have a chance. Given how it is a high priority among a lot of Senate Democrats to invest more in affordable housing, and one can imagine that that those gain greater likelihood with a Democratic Senate. I do also want to add, since we're on the topic of appropriations, just a few other I think key context items, and that is one thing. We are in the final year of the Budget Control Act, which has been constraining HUD appropriations for almost the entire decade. There have been these deals that have helped provide some space under budget caps over the years, but it's always been a challenge, and the fact that Congress had to act to do that has constrained, I think, the ability for appropriations to be increased. And so I think that being freed from those Budget Control Act spending caps going forward will be a great help to potential for providing more resources to HUD. The other piece I'd also note is, I think one of the reasons why the House passed bill was able to be more than normal is because the amount of receipts that HUD gained through HUD and Ginnie Mae was increased by $2 billion over last year's amount, and that provided a decent amount of funding for HUD programs. Is very useful. So I think those are just two things I'd add in the appropriations picture.
And I would love to just add on to Peter's point that I'm so glad you brought that up about the Budget Control Act being over, and hopefully those caps we will never see again. But there's always a threat that it might be a point that Republicans stick to about wanting to extend those budget caps into future years. And so I know that's something I'm sure Peter's paying a lot of attention to. We're focusing on too, to see if this comes up in the context of a COVID relief package, or does it come up in the context of other budget issues. We have to really be vigilant about making sure that our members of Congress know just how harmful those caps have been, even if they've provided temporary relief or limited relief from them.
Really helpful. Thank you, guys. I want to turn now to something that we're all focused on for a number of years, which is provisions to potentially strengthen and expand the low-income housing tax credit program, which of course is our main engine for producing new affordable homes. And I want to put up on the screen just briefly, Peter referenced the, I think several of you have actually, the Moving Forward Act, HR 2. So I'm going to put that up and invite Sarah Brundage for you just to talk briefly a little bit about the Action Coalition's perspective on what's on the table and how this is likely to play out.
Sure, yeah. So we've been really advocating throughout this entire pandemic for there to be housing credit provisions, given how the housing credit has been impacted by this crisis. Some of our top priorities, we really, worked with our congressional champions to identify and narrow down priorities that are in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And our top priority has been enacting a permanent 4% housing credit rate. This is a key provision of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, but we find that it's more important than ever because unlike other tax credits, the 4% housing credit rate is tied to federal borrowing rates, which fluctuate and are at all-time lows in response to the economic downturn. And so I think for August, it was back at the historic low of 3.07%. Am I right, Peter?
Yep.
And so, this is jeopardizing many affordable housing developments. And so, we've been seeking the permanent 4% housing credit rate as a response measure. We've also, in terms of additional relief, been advocating for lowering the 50% test. This is in reference to the threshold of bond financing required for developments in order to trigger the 4% housing credit rate. And we've also asked in terms of longer term economic recovery, expanding the housing credit by 50% and phasing that in over 2 years versus 5 years to really acknowledge that we need to protect and bolster our pipeline of affordable housing. And we also included asks for additional basis boosts for developments that need to access additional equity for financial feasibility, specifically looking at a basis boost for housing bond finance properties, properties in rural areas and tribal communities, as well as properties serving extremely low-income households. And we also had a set of regulatory asks related to key programmatic deadline extensions given delays in construction that we were seeing across the field. So, and I think we've found that there's been a lot of bipartisan support for these measures. And again, really big thanks to all of the advocates who've been part of this effort. We did an action sign-on letter that had more than 2,300 organizations on it calling on Congress to include our housing credit proposals in the next COVID response package. Our congressional champions sent in letters, bipartisan letters to House leadership. Most recently, there was a member sign-on letter on the House side that it was 103 representatives, bipartisan, signed on about the importance of these measures. We had a mayor's letter with 69 mayors sign on, but what you've probably heard as we've discussed these negotiations, the housing credit provisions have not made into the proposals. And what we've been really told is that we have a lot of support from leadership in particular, on the House side. However, they've been really hesitant to include what they consider industry-specific tax provisions in any of these packages. I don't think any of us would disagree with this. They really want to make sure that any provisions in the COVID response packages are directly responsive to the crisis. So we've really just been trying to educate members on how the 4% housing credit rate is directly impacted by this. But I think there's just a lot of negotiating that has to happen. We're not seeing really robust tax sections of these proposals. And often, I think what we're hearing from the staff level is a concern that, oh, if we let in the housing credit provision, there are many other tax credits like tied to energy or new markets and whatnot that they feel like they would then have to include as well. So as Peter mentioned, though, the House did pass an infrastructure package in really early July, and it included a robust section for the housing credit. These are probably the most provisions passed by a chamber of Congress for the housing credit in quite some time. It included all of our action housing credit priorities and some. Something that Californians, I know Matt was, I'm sure, very happy to see. It also included increasing the bond cap. So there's many other robust provisions in here. It also included $100 billion in affordable housing infrastructure and a neighborhood homes credit that's a new tax credit tied to financing home ownership in distressed communities. So it had a really big housing section, which shows that our collective message that housing is infrastructure is also working. I think from the Action Campaign's perspective, we're really thrilled that this is serving as a baseline for future infrastructure negotiations. That being said, we're still pushing for, if we could get one thing in, that 4% housing credit rate to be included in the next COVID package. But, it's really hard when Congress can't even agree on rental assistance and eviction moratorium extension to shoot for other housing provisions. So that's kind of where we're at right now with our housing credit advocacy.
Thank you. That was an incredibly helpful overview and rundown of all the different provisions that the Rental Housing Action Coalition has been working on so hard. And thanks to you and Peter and other leaders of that coalition for your work. I did want to note that, of course, a California perspective is that in addition to the 4% floor on the 4% tax credit, that getting the bond problem, the capacity problem fixed is essential, because we have more than 3 times as much demand as we have supply right now for private activity bonds, and that has become the traffic jam in California. So I really appreciate that you all have, even though it's not a national, consistently national issue, that you have incorporated that in, and it's thanks to help from some of our colleagues in California, we've gotten that on the table.
Yes.
Peter.
I think you have a lot, I was just going to say, you have a lot to look forward to with that too, because on the Senate side, Senate Finance Committee Ranking Member Ron Wyden introduced a bill a companion bill that is the same housing credit provisions from the Moving Forward Act. It also includes these bond cap provisions that you're speaking to, both lowering the test and increasing the cap. He introduced that with Senator Cantwell, who's of course historically our housing credit champion. So I think that you won't see that provision going away, if I had to guess.
Appreciate that. Peter, we need to wrap up the section. You've been very involved. What I'd really like you to focus on is, for all of the nonprofit housing developers who are tuning into this broadcast, in particular the finance folks, can you just use your best crystal ball? And if you want to give me 2 scenarios, given how the election might go, that's fine. But tell us what we can expect and when, most realistically from your perspective.
Fair enough. I think if there is a decent sized deal on COVID-19, something that's not just absolute barest minimum to ensure the economy doesn't completely fall apart, I do think there's a good chance. And I'll just note that the bipartisan letter that Sarah Brundage mentioned, where we had 103 members that spanned the ideological spectrum, everyone from progressive Democrats to Freedom Caucus Republicans, signed on to that letter, which did include that lower.
Did we lose Peter?
We might have. But his point was the bipartisan letter did include lowering the 50% test.
I think it was great. It was great to have that level of support, and that has, I think, given us a shot Certainly, I'd say the minimum 4% is the most likely. And then depending on the size of the deal, maybe a couple of other provisions might be able to be added as well. I think, again, we'll know that once the contours of the deal on COVID-19 happens. But whatever happens this year, I do think that looking forward to next year, there's likely to be a major piece of tax legislation next year, no matter what happens in the election. But if the Democrats do, sweep the government, I could imagine that infrastructure legislation coming back, and much of that being having a serious chance of being enacted early next year, if anything did not happen this year. And I'll break a little bit of news here. By the time this is recorded, I think Novogradac will have our estimate of the unit financing impact of the House bill. And we're, again, there might be some slight changes by the time this airs, but we're estimating about 950,000 units over 10 years, which is a substantial amount, more than any other piece of legislation involving the housing credit in the past. So it would be a fabulous thing if this legislation were to be passed.
That's fantastic. And so we're getting active questions. We have a team of 20 housing finance experts working on a couple hundred transactions in California. And I'm constantly getting queried about, will the 4% floor be in place by the end of December, because there are actual business decisions being made. And I'm always hedging, saying I need to talk to you guys. So I do want to just get your best take on, should a nonprofit housing developer making these decisions gamble on the 4% floor being in place by the end of this December?
I think it's a very good chance. Maybe I'm being a little optimistic, because even if there is not included as part of a COVID-19 legislation, there is likely to be some sort of action. If you have a CR that goes until after the election, they're going to have to extend the government again, and that provides another potential vehicle for that. And given, I think one of the reasons why the minimum 4% is one of the most likely to be enacted is given its tie to COVID-19. I mean, the lowest rate you can have for the 4% rate, unless the federal borrowing rates go negative, which if that ever does happen, our economy is in serious trouble, is 3.00. The fact that, as Sarah mentioned, we're at 3.07, it is extraordinarily historic lows. And I think there's an increasing recognition from Congress that that is a huge problem for affordable housing production and preservation. So I think that given that, if it's not happening in a COVID-19, that we could potentially have at a year-end either an omnibus appropriations, or if there's yet another CR to the next Congress, that we could have a chance there as well.
Sarah Brundage.
And there could also be, tax extenders package. A lot of tax credits are expiring. They got kicked down the road just 1 year last year. They'll probably get kicked down the road another year at the end of this year. And so that'd be another great package for it to ride with. I'm hesitant to give people, well, I'm definitely not giving anyone business advice officially, but I'm hesitant for people to, bargain on that. But I do think we have a better shot than we've ever had before.
Sarah Saadian?
You have two of the strongest advocates in the tax space, so I would go based on what they predict. They would know more than I would, though.
All right, well, let's turn to another topic that you know a lot about in our remaining minutes, which is the outlook for regulatory changes. The Trump administration, particularly with a fair housing rollback of an Obama-era fair housing rule, and of course, other parts of the administration have begun weakening the Community Reinvestment Act. So thoughts about how we might see that play out, particularly around the election outcomes?
Yeah,
I can go ahead,
first,
Sarah.
Sarah. Yeah, I know you. Are you sure?
I was going to say that I think we're seeing that, especially around fair housing, it's becoming more of an election issue. Just this weekend, the president and HUD Secretary Ben Carson published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal claiming that Democrats are going to ruin suburbs, but it's really a fight about fair housing. And I think they are seeing this as being a lot of racist, incendiary language that might be able to spur up some votes among suburban women. It's really disappointing to see this administration continue with its really racist attacks constantly on the Fair Housing Act included. But we're also seeing other regulatory issues in the fair housing space too. I mentioned earlier that HUD has, we're currently in the comment period, which ends on the 22nd of September, for HUD's proposed anti-transgender rule, which would allow shelters that are publicly funded to turn away people who are transgender who are seeking shelter. I think it also points to perhaps like the risk of another 4 years of the Trump administration that really now has its, sea legs under them about how to, dismantle the regulatory process and regulatory protection.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, for viewers that the AFFH rule, just to be completely clear, was completely rolled back when HUD introduced its new final rule, the Preserving Community and Neighborhood Choice Rule. It actually rolls back the standards in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing to pre-1994. So before AFFH, there was the analysis of impediments, and it goes back before that. So we'll see this definitely, come up in the courts. I know that civil rights and fair housing legal advocates will sue on this process because as a final rule or not even taking further comments. But it really does underscore the need for a new administration to rebuild our regulations that guide us on how we fulfill that Fair Housing Act duty, which remains intact. So the administration can take away these regulations, but the duty for HUD grantees to firmly further fair housing remains. And that's something that everyone needs to be careful about because they could still be challenged if their housing policies are not furthering fair housing. Now, thankfully, in California, you all passed the state law to firmly further fair housing, which is a great demonstration in terms of leadership's commitment to fair housing. In addition to the equal access rule that Sarah mentioned, we're also expecting a final rule on the disparate impact rule to come out likely in October, but soon, and that will also be big because the disparate impact standards that HUD is proposing to dramatically change would essentially make it, virtually impossible to pursue a disparate impact court case. And that's, that makes up a lot of contemporary discrimination cases. So that's another really important fair housing development to look out for.
Great, thank you. And in our remaining few minutes, Peter, I'd really love for you to give us your outlook on what's happening with Community Reinvestment Act. I will just say as a bit of context, in California, we're already seeing some small and medium-sized banks pulling back from syndication funds, nonprofit syndication funds primarily, that would typically be investing. So we've seen tens of millions of dollars already gone, and we think it's just the beginning. So tell us what you see coming in your crystal ball on Community Reinvestment Act.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. I know those who have been going to Housing California in the past, I've been warning you that this was potentially coming, and unfortunately this May it did come out, a final rule that reformed the SIRA regulations that are so important to the investment in the low-income housing tax credit. Roughly 85% of the annual investment demand comes from CRA motivated institutions, and the regulations that were released really do, I think, potentially undermine the demand for the low-income housing tax credits. It will take some time. It's not something that happens overnight, but it is, unless those regulations are revoked, it could potentially really reduce the amount of the volume investments, especially among the smaller institutions, Matt, that you were mentioning. The good news is that I think there is pretty clear that if the Democrats do take over, that this regulation could be completely revoked. It does. That's all it would take is President Biden appointed comptroller of the currency deciding to revoke it. It hasn't been fully implemented. It has a long period of implementation. For some banks, it is fully implemented by January 1st, 2023, and for others, it's 2024. And so, it would be a dramatic reversal if that new comptroller revoked that. And I do think it's worth just reminding you all that this was something that just the OCC promulgated, not the Fed, not the FDIC, was sort of underscored that it did not have universal support among the federal banking regulators. And I would anticipate that, with a new comptroller, that the agencies would get back together again and come up with a more durable, long-standing, which could potentially increase housing credit investment. There are many changes that I mentioned before, and we don't have time to get into them now, but there are plenty of things that could have been, can be done to actually increase and make it even a better tool for housing credit investment with appropriate changes to the regulations.
Thank you for that. All right, I'd like each of you just to take a minute and say what you would most like for Californians with our two Democratic senators who are a bit sidelined at this moment and our many Democratic House members. What do you think would be most strategic for us to focus on for advocacy for the next few months? Sarah Sadia?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that need your advocacy, and I want to reiterate a point that both Sarah and Peter have made before, which is that we are in such a strong position on all of these issues because of the advocacy work that folks in California and across the country have been doing. So it's really, my message to you is to keep up your excellent work that you've done so far. In the short term, we're very much focused on the COVID relief package and making sure that there are resources in there for renters and for people experiencing homelessness. So please continue to do that. We have a lot of buy-in from California Democrats especially, and it's good to continue to check in with them to reiterate that this has to be a priority and to thank them for their leadership on this, and for Republicans to put pressure on them to also be joining the call for those resources, even if they're doing it behind the scenes with their leadership or with committees. And then on the appropriations side, I think we'll likely see a CR, we mentioned that, but it would be good to remind folks about how harmful a long-term CR can be to housing programs, reiterate that we need an actual spending bill, and educate them over the next couple of months about that issue.
Thank you. Sarah Brendage.
I would just say, in addition to what Sarah said, because the COVID negotiations are at such a high level, Speaker Pelosi, as far as we're concerned, it's like, unless you have a direct line to Schumer Pelosi, it's kind of above your pay grade right now. So I think, maybe from the housing credit perspective, as developers are seeing challenges in their properties, especially the 4% credit rate properties, and can demonstrate, new gaps in their capital stack or new financial challenges, share those project examples with Pelosi's office. She is a champion. We're so lucky to have her, but just to remind her how this is directly tied to the crisis and that this is one of the top priorities for Californians. And then I would also just say more generally, since Senator Harris is now the vice president nominee, this isn't even about communicating directly to her, but California as a state is grappling with one of the greatest state level affordable housing crises, continuing to make it a priority at the local and state level, continuing to discuss it in the media. Will just continue to develop a potential vice president who's really educated and passionate about affordable housing, potentially in the next administration. That would be really powerful.
Great reminder. Thanks for that.
I need to do this slide. I have to jump off, but I'll look forward to following up with all of you guys later.
Thanks so much, Sarah, Sadia. And Peter, your closing comments.
Right. I think both Sarah's covered it very, very well. One thing I also note, I know some of you may not be working in the Bakersfield area, but you do. California is really unique by having both Speaker Pelosi as well as Leader McCarthy there. This has been, housing has been a bipartisan issue, especially the low-income housing tax credit, to continue to remind them that this is a huge, important issue for California is something that I think would be very helpful as we go. It's often the case, there's already lots of great work that's already happened, but you have to often follow it up and do some more in the closing moments just as before a deal is struck.
Thanks for that. That's a really important reminder. A big thank you to Sarah Brundage, Sarah Sadian, and Peter Lawrence for all of these insights. And all of the organizations have a lot of material. It's Enterprise Community Partners and National Income Housing Coalition and Nova Granick and Company. And the California Housing Partnership also has some California-specific information on our website. So we hope that you all keep engaging, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.